Okay, welcome. Let's talk about the cult of domesticity, that is also known as the cult of true womanhood, from around the dates of 1820 to 1860, and its relation to scientific sexism. So let's go ahead and get started. So, what does this mean to you? Have you heard about it? What do you think about it? What Even just looking at the definition or the words themselves, what might come to mind? And while you're thinking on that, I'll give you a little bit of background. Between 1820 and 60, there formed a new American ideology of feminine behavior and an ideal of womanliness known as the cult of true womanhood or the cult of domesticity. In 1966, Barbara Welter sort of provides a fresher look and a new exploration into the cult of true womanhood in her article, her influential article titled The Cult of True Womanhood 1820 to 1860. And so she really delves into it and more. You've also got there's a code. The cult of true womanhood or the cult of domesticity offered women a code of behavior based on social regulations for middle class families with newly acquired wealth and leisure. And ultimately, the way women received instruction as to how they ought to behave and what sort of behavior was expected of them was from women's magazines, advice book, and all their other forms of popular culture at the time. So we're looking at the post-industrial family structure, and primarily this concept of the cult of domesticity or the cult of true womanhood was focused on 19th century middle class white families. A whole different set of rules for other folks on the socioeconomic scale, and also for people of color. And so you want to think about the cult of true womanhood or domesticity was designed for wives and daughters of men who made up America's white, middle, and upper class power structure. There was a shift with the greater industry happening, and post the Industrial Revolution, we have families who don't have to be self-sufficient anymore, and so that leads to men being able to have higher incomes and more disposable income. So we have a growing middle and upper middle class. But we also have it's what's called new money, and that's something that plays a big part in the story Daisy Miller. You've also got to focus on who can be in the public and who can be in the private. And of course, because of this time period and the prevalence of heterosexuality and the acceptance of heterosexuality and the sort of ignoring of and not acknowledging any other sexuality, I'm primarily speaking in terms of heterosexual relationships. Also, when we're thinking about gender during this time period, it was much more on the binary of traditional perspectives of what male gender would be and female gender would be, and only really looking at male and female gender. So that's the basis from which this discussion stems, because of that historical and social context. So men worked and existed in the public realm outside of the home, and then they came into the home, but that wasn't really their domain, other than they would be the ultimate say-so as the patriarch, and so how money was spent and doling out of money and final decisions of the household would still be theirs, but their major sphere of influence would be existing in the public realm. children and wives and women were relegated to the sphere, the private sphere of the home. Uh, the public world was considered too rough for women. They were thought to be too weak or delicate, and in need of protection by the patriarch and by the security of the home. Uh, this leads to insulation and maybe even isolation. But the family became, and the family unit was focused on the family and the relatives and was insulated from the outside influence other than what the patriarch brought in or what came in through the ladies' journals and magazines and things of that nature. So there's an interesting shift in that the society community is lessening in importance, and the individual family unit is becoming more dominant and more of greater import. So, Good Day's Ladies book is the most popular and was the more prestigious and most widely circulated ladies magazine in the US, and from its beginning with its first publication in 1830. Uh, its guiding contents, it had advice for good housekeeping handbooks, it had texts of sermons, lectures, and even speeches and legislatures that were often geared toward guiding women into how they ought to behave, and also elevating domesticity to the divine in the sense of trying to make this correlation between uh, righteous women living righteously. All content in the magazine was geared toward promoting women's high, holy, and only position in the home, and how following the code of behaviors would guarantee godliness for women and elevate their standing in society. Motherhood was encouraged as a religious value, and then there were the four virtues or ideals of true womanhood or domesticity that were reflected not only in the writings but also in the paintings and the pictures and the poetry that were depicted in the women's magazines for each of the four virtues and ideals, which we'll get into shortly. Uh, What's also interesting, especially when we think about modern day and modern day ladies, women's magazines, men's magazines, anybody's magazines, and where things may have begun, this concept of fashion and women being presenting themselves for the male gaze, for to be attractive and desirable to males, particularly in this time period, it was geared toward women making themselves attractive to their husbands. Uh, so although we were moving toward a space where women are educated, they're often educated in womanly tasks and ideas, and educated in a way to be of a support to the husband, and not for education's sake. So here are a few quotations for you to think on and consider how that sort of domesticity and the divinity sort of connection, and that there was an elevation of the woman, but it's often presented in religious terms. So here are the four virtues and ideals of true womanhood or true domesticity to which I referred earlier, and we will speak to each individually. And so you want to think about what piety is, and ultimately within this concept of this value, this belief of piety is the belief that women had a need for religious guidance. And not only did they have that need, but then there was also a belief that women had a propensity for religion, that they would grasp it and understand it. And so they could achieve a pious standing. There was also this concept that women of the time were considered the new Eve. And if you want to think about what we've mentioned about the Judeo-Christian perspective of the Garden of Eden and the fall of Adam and Eve and what role Eve was perceived to have played. Uh, and so this concept is that now women, as the new Eve, are working with God to save the world through individual women's pure, passionless love. And so that's sort of what the prevailing viewpoint was. You'll notice that the images that I'm showing you, they're from Gooday's Ladies' Journal, and they often are, if you look, the Lord's Prayer, look at the the women are often connected with children. Also, look at they're often on bent knee. They're in submissive and dependent postures, uh, and usually below any males. But you can sort of see how even visually things are uh, moving to support some of these concepts. So the flight of time, how are you keeping yourself busy? Does even looking at the ladies' book, the magazine, following these values and principles elevate you spiritually? Notice that in the right-hand picture here, this is a picture with the males front and center. The woman is sort of bending and maybe even toiling with her finger on her brain to understand what the male in the picture clearly is explaining to her. Notice on the left-hand side here, we have good counsel. I want you to look at the way that the women are dressed and their postures and their facial expressions, and then look to the right and what evil counsel looks like and how it's a little bit sexed up and alluring, and even look at sort of what the animal on the left hand side is that, and then what's on the right hand side, throwing down of the book. Could that be the lady's book of guidance? And so, and the hair is down, which would be like gearing up for some bow bow chicka bow bow, whereas it's all tied up and put up and not trying to be alluring in the left hand picture. So that leads us to purity and virginity. Ultimately, for a woman, particularly during this time period, her greatest treasure would be her purity and her virginity. And especially before marriage, lots of reputations hang on the fact of whether or not the woman is pure and virginal. There are there's some really precarious things with the femme sole and the with a married woman. Interestingly, a married woman has no legal or emotional existence separate from her husband, and a single woman doesn't have that much more, that many more rights, but does have a little bit more ownership. Uh, but then at the same time, whether the woman is a widow or an unmarried woman, there's lots of derogatory comments in this society during this time and even before. That sees a single woman as not fulfilling her obligations or living up to her potential or being as spiritual or righteous, and often being spoken of as derogatory terms. It's all about power and control, right? And um, a woman's purity would be her only weapon, and it was her goal and purpose to keep men in control of their sexual needs. So notice how this can lead us to current perspectives about rape culture and women being the victims, being uh, victim shamed and victim blamed. Uh, when this is sort of the ideology permeating throughout time. There's also something fascinating happening with 19th century purity fetish. Even though America is considered separate from England and its own set of colonies, America was still very influenced by a number of Victorian ideas and beliefs that were put forward by Queen Victoria, who sat on the throne during this time period. And this is especially when it comes to sex. Uh, this is a time period when an era when people were reported to be very frigid and factually ignorant about sex. Sex was also used as a powerful tool to oppress and control society, especially women. Euphemisms abound, especially people would say limbs, not legs. That would be too sexually provocative. Uh, when you're talking about eating meat, you would say white meat, not breast meat, because you wouldn't even want to verbalize the word breast. That in this purity mindset is even translated into not only the dress and the clothing of the time. You notice that collars go up to the bottom of the chin, uh, sleeves go all the way past the wrists, dress go all the way to past the ankles, covering sort of sexually stimulating zones and sensitive zones of the body. But you've also got that purity mindset with interior design. If you look at the design of the period, uh, tables had coverings that covered the legs of the tables. Chairs had coverings that covered the legs of the chairs. So this really rigid and confined perspective of sexuality. You've also got separation of the genders. Remember, we're speaking in binary for this time period, but this was true of all things. Males behaved in different ways and lived in different spheres and played in different spheres, and women were relegated to different spheres and different activities. And as we've spoken about in the past, this is true for male and female authors and what they could and couldn't write about as well. This is when we also get, if any of you are familiar with Cabbage Patch dolls and the story of the Cabbage Patch or the stork, we have non-sexual origin stories. It wasn't that people had sexual intercourse to have children, but that there was anything to do with any sort of reproductive organ, but some bird, a stork, brought the babies, or they just popped up in cabbage patches. And so just a lot about that. That's where we get the white, virginal white, right? And white as the driven snow, some of that imagery from the Judeo-Christian Bible. And the first tribute is on the right-hand side, we've got children, right? And that being the major focus for a woman's attention. Then we move to the third value or belief, submissiveness. It's important to see this, that people can choose to be submissive, thoughtfully submissive, purposefully submissive, but this was a passive submissiveness where women were passively submissive to fate, to duty, to God, and to men without question or thought. It was automatically accepted, so that would mean even if some people are treating the women poorly, that they would still have this expectation to be submissive. I mentioned a little bit about fashion earlier. In addition to, you can see the right hand side up to the neck, to the wrists and everything, but you've also got a lot of restrictive clothing, and that's something fascinating to look at and think about fashion over time, and think about even in modern day high heels. Can women run fast in high heels? So what about the clothing emphasizes another sort of passivity and encourages dependency. So we have the corsets that cinch the waist, and we'll look at some pictures of that in a moment. But you want to think about, especially if you're pulling and tying these corsets, the women didn't all have these little teeny waists, but what's happening is because they are forcing themselves into these undergarments, that it's pinching their inner organs and it's shifting their inner organs, and it's also not allowing them, their lungs are having pressure, so they can't take deep breaths. So there's some reasons why we see and hear women fainting during this time and things of that nature. We've also got uh, the undergarments, uh, the dresses are, and the numerous undergarments. They would have sort of stockings, then they would have the little the words escaping me, but the pantaloons, then they would have the corsets, then they would have a slip, then they would have the actual hoops for the dress, then they would have the dress on top. So think about how heavy their clothing would be, and notice that everything about their fashion would limit their mobility, limit their ability to engage in rigorous activities. Uh, and you can see also what a sensible woman feels, and that dependence and inferiority are badges of honor during this time period. So here's what a regular woman's body ought to look like with their organs unrestricted. This is what it looks like on the left-hand side, and you can see how things shift. And then this is sort of what some of the undergarments to which I was referring before look like. You also want to see uh, the uniformity. So notice how a human body should be looking, and that there is not quite as much uniformity. And then look at how the corset actually works to shift things and alter things for women. Here, there's a museum, the Moody Museum in Philadelphia, and they have these a lot of skeletons. It was considered to be a teaching hospital at one point that they turned into a museum that has a lot of. It's like a time capsule for this time period in science. And what's interesting is, although we have some uniformity with our ribs, they aren't exactly perfect, and there's some space, right? I really want you to see how the physiology of women was altered by wearing corsets, and also how that could lead to some of the um, organ failure that they had and other ailments that would have bound them. Here are some commonly held truisms about 19th century women that were presented in the 19th century and found in some of these ladies' magazines. And so please go ahead and read and ponder those on your own. Uh, there was a lot about scientific sexism at the time, and using science to uh, make claims and arguments about the inferiority of women and the superiority of men. And that's particular when it comes to intellectual inferiority. Women were considered intellectually inferior to men. Often the brain size, science uh, justified this because they thought that women's brains were smaller than men's brains. And then the way that they sort of worked through this was that the size of the brain was connected to the body weight. But then this concept and this justification for female inferiority was abandoned when it was discovered that the female brain to body rate yielded a higher ratio than that of men. Then you've also got the brain weight to body height. The female brain was considered inferior and more primitive than the male brain because of women traditionally being shorter than men. This comes to this concept of phrenology, and there's the definition for you. And ultimately, phrenology is now considered a pseudoscience today, and it's mostly discounted. But especially during this time, the concept of using skull shapes as an indicator of mental abilities was founded by the German physiologist Franz Joseph Gall in the early 1800s, and it was considered to be modern science of the time, and it was used to espouse some of the claims that I've mentioned previously. Uh, In addition to being a faulty science that was not only used to affirm sexist beliefs, it was also used to affirm commonly held racist beliefs at the time about the supposed inferiority of women, but also of non-white races. And here are some pictures of the ways that people were looking at phrenology and how the brain worked during the time, and you can sort of compare it to your own understanding of how the brain functions with our modern day understanding of how things go. And then we've got domesticity as the last aspect of true womanhood, the cult of true womanhood, or the cult of domesticity. And so we've got uh, housework is thought to be an uplifting task, and there were approved duties such as needlework and crafts and sewing and music playing, things that could ultimately create a refuge for the men. The home was supposed to be a refuge for the men, a place for them to escape from the immoral world of business and industry. So this was supposed to be, again, a place of purity, a place of piety, a place of refuge. So everything was done for the comfort of the patriarch in the home. And so you can see sort of even with the children, especially the male children, the women would have taken a second seat. The male child would have been of more value than the woman in the household. This is an interesting way to see, again, the male. Even you can see visually the dominance, the superiority of the male to the female, and the female being on the same level as the children. And often males would speak to women as if they were children and paternalistically, and you'll see that in some of the literature. And maybe think about that particularly with James's and Chopin's pieces. In addition to the scientific sexism reflected in the intellectuality, it's also reflected in the physical. Women were considered to be physically inferior. They were often smaller than men, so they were considered to be weaker because they weren't as large. You've got, as I mentioned earlier, women would faint a lot, and they were thought to have less stamina. But don't forget, their physiology was changing. They were getting more ailments because of the corsets they were wearing. They were also thought inferior physically because of their monthly menstruation, their periods, right? And because they were often physically incapacitated every month. And what gets worse is that often the period was thought to bring on temporary insanity for women. And so we still have remnants of this perspective today, right? When people will say derogatory things like, are you on your period? Or you must be on your period, to excuse a woman or to explain why a woman, a menstruating person, might behave the way the person is. But it's also thought that women were more delicate than men because their nervous system was finer and more prone to fatigue because of their reproductive system. So everything about the feminine reproductive system was, or the female reproductive system was inferior to the male productive system. Here's a quotation for you that even uses religion to help affirm this, the female being inferior to some degree. There's also this reflex irritation, is that any imbalance, infection, or fatigue would cause a reaction elsewhere in the body. So if there, and of course, coming from the faulty reproduction system, if a woman had an ailment anywhere, it was assumed that it probably originated with the reproductive system. And so Again, on the left, you can see what domesticity looks like. And then to the right, when I spoke about the male gaze, we think about female augmentation of the body being a modern day thing. But you can see that this concept of creating a larger bust is something that happened earlier. And this isn't to dismiss that women can want to have a larger bust for themselves, but we can see where some of this stems from in the early 1800s in terms of women making themselves appealing to the males in their lives. Uh, Again, we've got a lot of women spending time with women, certainly not with other men. Women, what are they? They need to be pleasing, sing, play music, recite poetry. For males, at entertainment. And then when we get to scientific sexism and sexuality, when we think about human sexuality during this time, there's some really fascinating and, like I said earlier, um, ignorant perspectives on sex and sexuality. So it's thought that the human body at this time, it was thought that the human body had a finite amount of energy and it needed to be regulated, and this was particularly true for men, and that if men were engaging in sexual activities, then they were giving up some of their energy and life force and giving it to women, actually, and so that had to be done sparingly. There was a primitive perspective about sexuality, and instead of seeing it as something natural and something beautiful and something healthy, it was thought that the sexual instinct was something primitive and something to be ashamed of and to uh, restrict. Uh, there was a mixed perspective. So on one hand, it was very much a paradox. On one hand, women were thought to have no sex drive at all whatsoever and have no desire for a sexual desire or pleasure. But and then there was another perspective that women were oversexed and hyperly sexual, and so uh, it was men had a strong, healthy sex drive, women didn't, or women were so overly sexual that you had to contain them and hold it in and keep them from engaging in it. So that's why there's so much hang up on the purity and the virginity, but also, are men being made cuckolds? Are women cheating on men? And are they living that pious and upstanding life? And energy vampires, if you're familiar with what shadows do in the dark, I think that's the name of the film and then television show. But there's a thing: energy vampires suck your energy. Males feared women's prowess because they thought that they would be like vampires and drain the man of his vitalness, his vitality, uh, through the sex act and through the semen. And we are going to get into this a little bit. So, again, look at the position of the women, look at the standing of the position of the men. All these messages to help put forward this concept of the cult of true womanhood and domesticity. Uh, so, with women, uh, there women were encouraged to channel their energies just to having children, to having offspring. Uh, they also were discouraged from engaging in any sort of intellectual activity because all their blood was needed for reproductive organ development so that they could have children. Uh, it was thought at this time that education took about 20% of women's vital energy, so they couldn't spare it. And it was also thought that pregnant women must not strain their brains or their unborn children would be harmed. Uh, and they needed, because it was thought that women would exude too much emotion, particularly if they were engaging in intellectual activities, and they needed to avoid strong emotions, that they needed to avoid being intellectual. Keep this in mind when we get to Charlotte Perkins Gilman's, The Yellow Wallpaper, as well as what you read have been reading recently. So again, more images showing the role of the woman is very limited, not too many options or choices. Now, when it comes to intercourse, it was considered that uh, male semen had lots of powerful properties. So a woman's organs needed to be bathed occasionally in the man's vital force if she wanted to remain healthy. So the man had to have sex with her and ejaculate. Uh, it was also considered that if uh, women would live longer and be less prone to insanity if they had a husband to help them with their semen. So spinsters and celibates were thought to live shorter lives and were prone to more insanity. Um, for men, uh, they their focus they needed to focus their life force on getting ahead in the world, and therefore they were encouraged to reserve some of their sexual energies just for procreation and to help the women from going insane, I guess. It was considered that 1 ounce of semen was equal to 4 ounces of blood. So I really want you to think about what that reveals about a given society, that blood is something we can't live without, that semen was considered to be have even greater properties than blood. Again, going back to the Victorian restrictive perspective, especially when it comes to sexuality. So as much as you had to have sex to keep from going insane, if you masturbated or had too much sex, then it would lead to insanity and death. And the final thing was that if women were indifferent to sex, then that was a good thing for men. But then conversely, if women enjoyed sex or had pleasure with sex, then there was something wrong with the woman and she probably wasn't a pious woman or was perhaps a cheating woman. And so this is from Mrs. E. Little, What Are the Rights of Women, published in the Ladies' Wreath in 1848 to 1849. The right to love whom others scorn, the right to comfort and to mourn, the right to shed new joy on earth, the right to feel the soul's high worth. Such women's rights a God will bless and crown their champions with success. So at this time, women were published, but you can see the sorts of things that were acceptable to be published, and only in the ladies' magazines. But still, most of the published writers and authors in the ladies' magazines would be male works. And so here's my question for you. Have we come a long way? How many of these ideologies from even before the 1800s, but at least from this time period in which we're reading, permeate until even in the 2020s? And then here's a little works cited for you. So I look forward to seeing how you're going to apply some of these ideologies to the literature, what you're going to say about this in class, and I wish you a lovely day.